Olá, bem-vindo à Flup. Vamos a mais um painel? Um dos grandes problemas do racismo é que a maioria dos racistas não se veem como racistas. O apartheid é uma invenção da África do Sul. Nenhum dos povos europeus seria capaz de uma atrocidade como a de Derek Chauvin, o policial estadunidense que sufocou George Floyd até a morte. Não é racismo entrar atirando em uma favela. Não é racismo pedir para revistar uma mulher negra na saída de uma loja. Aliás, não é racismo impedir que jovens negros circulem por shoppings. Não é racismo pedir para que a pessoa negra suba pelo elevador de serviço. Não é racismo que todos os prédios brasileiros se constituam a partir de dois pilares, o elevador social e o elevador de serviço. Aliás, não é racismo que a arquitetura das casas e apartamentos do Brasil tenha um quarto de empregada e que a maioria esmagadora das mulheres que ocupam esses cubículos sejam mulheres negras. Não é racismo não ter uma pessoa negra em posição de comando em sua equipe. Não é racismo não ter nenhuma pessoa negra em posição de comando em sua equipe. Não é racismo não ter nenhuma pessoa negra em sua equipe. Não é racismo não ter tomado nenhuma cerveja nos últimos 3 anos com um amigo negro. Nada é racismo. Não é racismo que os desempregados sejam negros, que os moradores de rua sejam negros, que as pessoas encarceradas sejam negras. Racismo é aquele cara com a imaculada túnica branca, com o indefectível capuz branco, com aquela tocha alumiando os caminhos do ódio. Não é racismo passar a mão na bunda de uma mulher preta. Aliás, passar a mão na bunda de uma mulher preta não é nem racismo, nem machismo, esses dois irmãos siameses do ódio. Não é racista dizer que o racismo não é um problema meu. Não é racista dizer que o racismo não é um problema nosso. Vamos ao nosso painel.
Hello, my name is Isabel Moura Mendes and I'm a Portuguese Cape Verdean cultural manager and film curator based in Scotland. On behalf of Flup, the Rio de Janeiro Literary Festival of the Peripheries, or Festa Literária das Periferias, I welcome you to the festival's 9th edition. This year, due to the worldwide pandemic context that we're living under, Flup is taking place online from the 27th of October to the 1st of November. Going into the digital space has enabled the festival to further expand its offering and invite participants and audiences from beyond Brazil's borders into its 2020 edition. Under the overarching theme, Vulnerable Bodies, a diverse program will bring together important names from the Brazilian and international Black critical thinking space in a concerted effort to build bridges between literature and theater, sonography and spoken poetry, in an attempt to offer response to a context of blossoming and urgent need for political and social justice engagement. To learn more about Flup's 2020 online program, please visit the festival's website on flup.net.br. Today's panel discussion is being filmed in the UK, in Edinburgh, Scotland's capital city, and forms part of Flup's Around the World strand, made possible through a partnership between the festival and University College London, Just Festival, and the St. John's Church, where we are today. to all we are thankful. Recognized around the world as a leading festival city, drawing millions of visitors to its shores every August, Edinburgh is also the UNESCO City of Literature and the birthplace of the Scottish Enlightenment intellectual movement, having earned the nickname of Athens of the North a few centuries ago due to its neoclassical buildings and its reputation for knowledge. As with many other cities across the UK, these are the accepted narratives that Edinburgh carries. Maybe the only narratives worthy of note, some would have us believe. But if we're learning anything from the global civil uprising that followed the murders of the likes of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, amongst many, at the hands of the police in the UK, is that we can no longer be complacent and silently accept imposed narratives as truth. Narratives that have for centuries written off Black and brown bodies and minds out of history. This rude awakening to a litany of racially motivated police brutality, which has consistently traumatized, wounded, and killed Black people in the US, has direct echoes to the UK reality today. Even if their stories diverged at some point in time, both countries have successfully also developed their own brand of historical and educational curriculum whitewashing, deliberately erasing and overlooking the role they actively played in the genocide of African people through centuries of transatlantic slave trade and colonialist practices. Conveniently removed from public consciousness is also the fact that it is the profiting from such criminal doings that forms the foundation of the UK and consequently Scotland's wealth and current standing in the world. This tainted past has also directly contributed to the social, economical, and intellectual marginalization of British Black and brown communities, rendering them vulnerable. What is also true is that despite these challenges and the daily exposure to targeted discrimination and the colonialist legacy of systemic racism, Black and brown bodies have consistently refused to accept this imposed vulnerability. The current resurgence of anti-racist and social justice activism, online and on the streets, led by civil society organizations and spearheaded by the Black Lives Matter movement, now across the globe and in the UK, builds on the shoulders of abolitionists and freedom fighters who fought before us against this forced othering and vulnerability. Figures such as James Somerset and Mary Prince, as well as civil rights activists like Olive Morris, who co-founded the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent in London and the Brixton Black Women's Group. They catapulted conversations about race and the Black and brown lived experiences to the forefront of the public discourse in their own era. What is interesting about what is happening now and what brings us together today is the opportunity to understand a bit more about the generation that is taking this work forward in this moment in time. With me today are two Black Scottish authors and critical thinkers who are actively contributing towards the investigating and the peeling off of layers of historical erasure through their own creative practice. What supermodel, curator, and activist Eunice Olumide and author and socialite Shola von Reinhold are also doing is fronting a generation of educated, gender-fluid, non-conforming, polyglot, socially and politically aware, empowered, globally connected and locally engaged, articulated voices and bodies. Whether they see themselves represented in terms such as Black British or Black diaspora, the fact remains that the current generation of melanated people in the UK are speaking out from a different place now. A place where past influences such as religious rule books or assigned definitions of class or privilege are less and less relevant. And where the urgency of change means pushing forward, occupying and reclaiming spaces traditionally made unapproachable to them, such as the world of fashion, the publishing industry, or what or who is deemed to be permitted into social intellectual spheres. So I wanted to start by welcoming Eunice and Shola. I hope you can forgive me for my rather lengthy introduction, but I was really keen to situate the conversation that we're going to have today just a little bit more and give you maybe some ideas and thoughts that we can reflect throughout our conversation today and bring back. So I wanted to start with you, Eunice. I wanted to start with looking a little bit at your path, because you've trailblazed a career in fashion as a model in the last 15 years at least. In that time, you've expanded your professional path into broadcast, art curation, and acting. In 2017, you were awarded an MBE for your contribution to arts, broadcasting, and charity work. And not happy with that, the following year, you go and publish a book called How to Get into Fashion. And only a few months ago, you gained renewed exposure into the public discourse when you articulated your views on how racism plays out in the UK. And you suggested some of the solutions that we should be looking at to address it, namely revisiting street names of slave owners. So with all this amazing background and kind of active engagement that you have, I wanted to start with a bit of a comment and a provocation. Because it seems to me that you've been shattering some glass for a while now. And I wanted to understand where that drive comes from for a Scottish-born, Nigerian heritage Black woman to continually push the boundaries of the spaces that you exist in. Where does that drive come from?
I think for me, obviously growing up in a place like Edinburgh, having this cultural dichotomy of two completely different cultures combining in one, and coming from, I suppose, a traditional working class background, I kind of was, in the beginning, not so much aware in my really early years, say sort of 4, 5, 6 years old, of colour particularly. Mm-hmm. What was really fascinating to me, which was as I got older, that the way that the people around me started to change the way they treated me. And it was because of that I really started to understand this concept of race. At the same time, it's compounded by the fact that I'm in a situation where I'm in a completely Caucasian white environment. And I can see like a lot of, I suppose, injustices in terms of the social economic situation of the kind of working class communities. When I was growing up in Scotland, we have the kind of demise of shipbuilding, we have the demise of the traditional work occupations of the working class people. So we have a lot of serious social issues happening. We have a lot of drug addiction, we have a lot of alcoholism, we have a lot of families who are on really low incomes. And, you know, my mum was really courageous. She worked really hard. She had like 3 jobs when she was growing up to ensure that we had a good education, etc. And she made sure that I went to a particular school. And it was really funny because this school, it previously was a private school that is now a public school. I think that's the right way to say it. And it was in a really affluent area of Scotland. And so I was in this situation again where I was growing up in this council estate, but then I was going to this really well-off school. And literally, like, people in my school had horses, had like entire kind of mansion kind of castles. And I was like in this kind of tower block. And it was just so fascinating to me. I often contemplated the huge and significant difference between the way that people lived. So I think that a lot of the reasons that I am so conscious of social justice, why that means so much to me, is throughout my life I've been exposed to both extremes from both ends. Yeah. And I think as well, you know, when I was growing up, I really was not somebody that was interested in fashion. I had no intention of becoming a fashion model or working in that industry. It was something that kind of happened to me because I was scouted so many times. And I didn't even know it was a real job. I was a complete tomboy. I got into that industry, and I believe it was part of my destiny. And it was actually really helpful to my self-esteem because I had gone through a lot of racial trauma, and I had quite a low expectation and idea of myself. And again, what I was seeing or feeling or experiencing was this situation where I was coming from this background, and then I was being exposed to this other world of wealth, of people who had a care in the world. So I think a lot of my personal engagement in that comes from real life experiences and being really conscious of the different upbringings and the way that having a lack of access to life chances can really impact you. Mm-hmm. And the racial aspect of that just came naturally as I became older and became conscious of the fact that people treated me differently and discriminated.
Yeah, and that public engagement that you've had in so many different facets of your life, you know, whether that's like supporting and fundraising for charitable organizations because you believe in that social justice aim, whether that's engaging in conversations that are difficult and where sometimes you're being put in a position where you're representing a whole group of people sometimes. Has that changed the way that you see yourself in terms of the contribution that you give to Scottish society? Because you're talking about coming from a place where you felt like you were maybe surrounded by people who didn't look like you, especially if you went to a school, you know, that was in an affluent area. Has that changed your perception of yourself in the Scottish context?
I don't think that my perception of myself has changed because really I don't see myself as anything significant. I think the only thing that has come to my attention, as it were, is that the power of influence, how like just being yourself and having things that you believe in and sticking to them and fighting for that justice can be inspirational to the world. Like we're kind of taught in society within capitalism that, you know, there's nothing that you can do and that you can't do anything about your situation. And that's pretty much drummed into you by every facet. And what I've come to realize is that simply by walking in your own footsteps, you know, and by respecting, essentially you're standing on the shoulders of giants. So there are many women who've come before me who fought for, and men who fought for social justice, who fought for equality, and I think because I spent a lot of time studying world history, studying the history of Africa, going to Africa from a young age, looking at the Moorish contribution to Europe, understanding that Caribbean people, as we now call ourselves, or Moorish people then, have been in Scotland since the 4th century, understanding the impact of Africans on Europe, or Europa as we call it, knowing that, you know, Africa isn't Africa, it is Kush, it is Abyssinia. There were great kingdoms. There were kings like Mansa Musa who were so rich they threw off the entire European economy because they did so much charity. Understanding that prehistory before colonialism is so important to, and what I suppose informs and gives me the courage and strength to speak out and to say no. Like the representations of Africans is imposed and is preposterous and is nonsense, because if we go back pre-colonialism, we can see that Afro-Caribbean people or Africans are so revered and they've done so much, and so that's where you feel like this is unjust. And the fact that when we look at other situations in society, for example, the horrific Holocaust that happened in Germany, we see that there's a worldwide acknowledgement of how just horrific and awful that was. So therefore, when we look at the transatlantic slave trade, it is fascinating to me that it isn't met with the same automatic emotional reaction. And I find that fascinating from a social anthropological perspective, which tells me that we do need to campaign, we do need to fight for continued justice so that people understand that this was completely wrong, it was abhorrent, it's something that we should detest, and that it should never be met with any kind of trying to explain it or trying to say, oh, well, this happened or you were complicit in it. You would never say that. In any situation where something bad happens, you would just say, you would condemn it.
Yeah, and I think what I was calling in my introduction the erasure that has happened, you usually use the term collective amnesia.
Exactly, that is my term, which has become very popular, and it's literally just because that in itself, it's like, you know, people have completely denied that this has happened, and they've tried to use perhaps the most minority, you know, you would never talk about other Holocausts in history and name one or two people who might have been involved in it to kind of erase what happened. And in fact, in a court of law, it's irrelevant because, you know, they might be charged as an accomplice or an accessory, but the person that perpetrates the crime is the person that's done the crime. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's actually not even logical within a kind of, you know, a democratic society legally for you to even mention that. The people that would be punished significantly are the people who did those horrific actions. And when you've got a situation where people have been in indentured slavery for hundreds of years, not allowed to marry, not allowed their names, not allowed to practice their religion, not allowed to read, write, sell, profit, not even allowed to have their kids, like that does need to be articulated so that people understand that we're living in a situation where you have benefited from the proceeds of crime, and though those countries might not want anything back from you, you do need to set things right in the same way that we would do in any situation where war crimes or crimes have been committed.
Thank you. There's so much there already to unpick, and I definitely want to go back to that idea of erasure and then how that links with the issues around representation and how we exist as Black and brown bodies in the societies where we exist, in this Europa where we are. But before we do that, I'm really keen to bring Shola into the conversation as well. And so I just wanted to read a little bit about your own path before I ask you a few questions as well. So you're a recent graduate from the Creative Writing Masters in Literature at the University of Glasgow. You previously studied at Fine Art at Central St. Martin's, and you published at the Cambridge Literature Review, the Stockholm Review, just to name a few. You were at Cove Park Scottish Emerging Writers you were a Cove Park Scottish Emerging Writer in 2018, and recently won a Duard Award for Literature. Your debut novel, Lot, was released in spring of this year, and I'm quoting here, immerses readers in the pursuit of aesthetics and beauty while interrogating the removal of obscurement of Black figures from history. So first of all, welcome and thank you for your book.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, congratulations as well. So your book has been instigating some very interesting reflections from the reviews that I've been reading so far. And I wanted to start exactly there. So you've created a universe of characters such as Matilda and Hermia, whom you've conjured and set out on a quest to, as Isabella Scott so eloquently put in her review, investigate why there are so few queer Black British modernists documented in the flourishing interwar years. So I wanted to ask you if you could perhaps just expand a little bit around your motivation to write this book and set out on a journey exploring voices who didn't make it into history or are absent from history books.
Yeah, that I guess in some sense you could see it as like a kind of literary form of mourning for all of those erased figures that didn't get published, didn't get documented, have been consistently kept out of the archives through what people maybe call unconscious bias, but also definitely through active racism. And so the book centers around a character's search for Hermia Druitt, a sort of lost or forgotten Black Scottish modernist poet who's from Glasgow, or at least ostensibly from Glasgow, who knew sort of people like the Bright Young People and Bloomsbury Group, and was associated with figures like Virginia Woolf and sort of just the sort of broad scope of literary modernism in Britain. And she sort of emerged from two places, I guess. Like, on the one hand, she's a composite of all of these Black figures that I was encountering and sort of had, just come across over years, and people that have slowly been, I guess, uncovered. So, there were people like, Una Marcin living in London, who was a Jamaican poet who was, she moved to London in the 30s, and then she became the first woman to work for the BBC. I think she was the first broadcaster for the BBC, and she did that sort of amazing series. And then there were people, and then, there was like, she lived with a painter from Ronald Moody, who was a brother of Harold Moody, a sort of, the famous black activist in Britain. And then if you go to like, to Soho, to Fitzrovia, there were people like, Elizabeth Welch, the singer and artist, and I think she was also hooked into like the political networks in London at the time, and she was, friends of Paul Robeson, and she was partying with all of these people. And there's a scholar called Gemma Romain that's done just like the most amazing research into these figures, or sort of about black interwar London, and just keeps on uncovering all of these sort of amazing lives. And so Hermie is in many ways a composite of all of those, but at the same time, amongst all of those, what I couldn't find and what I still haven't been able to find, and yet what definitely existed, was like a black British woman poet working in the same sort of modernist experimental tradition as like Virginia Woolf, or I don't know, Hope Malise or Edith Sitwell, or so yeah, Hermie came as like she rose up out of that like vacuum, and she's like simultaneously a composite of all of these lost figures.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us just a bit more around how that journey was for you? Like, you were telling me that it took you 2 years to write the book. And so how was that journey in terms of kind of researching all of these? And how does that, I guess what I'm asking is, in the way that I was asking Eunice, in terms of how does that change your perception of existing in this case in the Scottish and the UK society? I'm just interested in understanding how that impacts your own existence.
I'm not really sure. I definitely can say I wish I'd encountered these figures and this information like when I was 14, when I was 16 and starting to read like British modernism, and a lot of those figures. So one of the things that drew me to British modernism was it was like an entry point into a certain kind of encountering of like queer history. Like I discovered sort of queer history through modernism, and yet it was so totally white. And so there was like more and more that sort of become a kind of compromise, I guess. I started to feel more compromised because these writers who I loved and adored were also sort of most of them were sort of humongous racists. A lot of them were, I guess, benefiting off colonialism in various ways. And so, as a reader, that was a sort of major source of conflict. So I wish I'd encountered these black figures existing among them, because these black figures were not only was the work of these white modernists. Blackness was foundational to like the European modernist project, to like the global modernist project, in so many ways that we're still finding out. Things like Virginia Woolf like knew people like Paul Robeson and met his wife, and was also in a Woolf scholar who's called Jane Goldman, who's based in Edinburgh, sort of found in one of Virginia Woolf's, in her manuscript for To the Lighthouse, sort of in the margins, is a name which is written, I think it's Tuma, and Jane was like looking through Woolf's library and found that there was a connection between, that Virginia Woolf and her husband had been reading like the Harlem Renaissance poets, and Jean Toomer was sort of one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance, although that's sort of like contested, but he was highly he influenced so many of them. And so she's found this like intertextual link between Toomer's like experimental novel Cain and Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse, and that's just one way in which like blackness is foundational to modernism. Then there's like the huge sort of forgotten queer the queer, I guess, like geographic overlap. You know, so in Soho, where there were all the queer clubs were, that's also where all the black clubs were, because that's sort of where they had to be, because that was like technically the margins of society in like, I guess, yeah. And then also, I guess, and like a lot of the socialists, the Marxists, the Pan-Africanists networks were there. So these were all converging. And there's like so many undercurrents between, I mean, black Soho was queer Soho as far as I'm concerned. And sort of all of these like undercurrents haven't been truly accounted for in literary history. And so yeah, to answer your question, I just wish I'd encountered all of this earlier and had been available to me, and it hadn't been such a, such a labour. I think this is something really particular of like, and it's a conversation I've had with a lot of like black artist friends in Scotland, is this constant generational rediscovery. So we will have to like consistently find out what the previous generation has done, and that generation had to do that already. And there's something very particular about our history where we have to do all of this work just to get to like the point of like the work that these people have already been doing, and it feeds into like the point of erasure as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's just like, obviously this is kind of in a way, all of this investigative work that you've done, all of this research that you've done to unearth it, but also at the same time, the understanding that it feels to me like once you've encountered that, and that erasure, that disappearance, that kind of like layers and layers and layers, it felt like you had to, because it has to do with obviously a lot of what your interests and even your connection with literature and with writing is about. And I think it's in a way, if I may, I think it's to our benefit, and kind of speaks a lot to what we were talking about as well. So, Eunice, I wanted to connect with what Shola was just saying, and also our initial considerations around erasure and how that plays out in normal life, but also how that connects with something that is being discussed more and more, which is a positive thing in terms of what type of representation do we want and what type of representation do we see in society in terms of all types of ethnic groups and all types of different ways of thinking, beliefs and all that. So I know that you've spoken out before on how there is a sense that Black British communities have traditionally been boxed in to pre-assigned spaces where they're allowed or expected to excel. And one of them, obviously, is kind of sports, which kind of goes back in time in terms of perpetuating kind of outdated misconceptions around Black race and physical prowess. So people like you, Naomi Campbell, Alec Weck, all of you broke the mold in terms of fashion industry. But there is still some kind of soft resistance, and I wonder if you want to question that, my expression of soft resistance from media outlets to uplift more contemporary Black faces in leading roles in science, arts, academia, and so on, many spaces. You've also spoken of not being able to, for example, find cosmetic products for your skin complexion, or seriously consider pursuing a career in broadcasting when no presenter looked anything like you, and how alienating for a young person in the midst of forming their own identity that can actually be. So again and again, you consistently go back to the issue of education and representation as possible solutions to these issues. So I wanted to just dig a little bit deeper and understand what do you think needs to happen there, and how would it stand to change the status quo that we want to see evolve?
Good question. I think that, of course, the issue is completely multifaceted, number one. We have to have an approach which is encompassing as many avenues as possible. I think primarily let's focus on the media. So I'm lucky enough to be in an industry which is fashion and the arts, which is very encouraging of diversity, although it has a lot of significant issues, which are, of course, a cosmos of what's happening in wider society. However, within the fashion industry, there are a number of, in recent history, very recent history, much more so, we do see dark-skinned women coming through. Traditionally, that has not been the case. But if we look at wider society, particularly within the commercial industry, within the general media, broadcasting, and things such as music, there is, in modern, more recent history, there is a complete omission of natural African female beauty. It's almost unacceptable to represent beautiful, natural black women with their afro or with natural styled hair. And we know that traditionally that has its roots in colonialism, in the transatlantic slave trade, where we see these definitions of good and bad hair. We know that, you know, afro has always been seen as a negative thing, as a difficult thing, and that goes right back to plantations, where there's preferences between in-house slave and out-house slave, and also to colorism, where there's preferences for light skin over dark skin. And what we've seen traditionally in popular culture and in the media is a preference for lighter skin and for hair of the texture that is more a Europeanized look. And we know that there is, you know, multi-billion industry in Afro-Caribbean hair care. It generates so much to world GDP, it's unbelievable. And most of these outlets, organizations, companies are not owned by black people. They're not owned by African people. They're owned by non-African people. And so they are continually perpetuating this image of beauty, which is completely tied into the Western canon of what is beautiful. And that is not just applying to Africans. We can see this right across the world, from Cambodia to India to the Middle East, where skin bleaching is practiced and straightening of the hair is practiced. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that, particularly within the United Kingdom, it's fascinating because we see ourselves as very kind of open and plural and diverse. And when we look at our nation, we probably think that, generally speaking, people tend to think that it's so much better than the United States of America, for example. However, when you really drill down into it, although the United States of America has, you know, these very obvious extremes where you can see black people being murdered on a day-to-day basis, at the same time, they have the opposite extreme of black people flourishing, of a black middle and upper class, of black people owning businesses in a way that's not seen in the United Kingdom. You see, you know, one extreme of, you know, Africanism and Pan-Africanism. And you see the extreme in the States of, you know, almost a hatred of self there, with a definite preference for anything other, anything Caucasian, which is highlighted in, I suppose, popular music, in music videos, where we see constantly until this day, black women always represented in, with, you know, weaves, wigs, etc., etc., and with often caricatures of what black beauty is. So unfortunately in the UK, we don't have those extremes. We have kind of one kind of Europeanized look which is acceptable, to the point where Afro-Caribbean children are not allowed to go to school with their natural hair. They are being expelled or sometimes suspended from school, or told not to come to school with either afro hair, cane rows, or protective styles, because that is seen as fashion. And that, it just is central to the lack of understanding within Europe of what it means to be African, of what is necessary to maintain our hair, which demonstrates a fundamental lack of any knowledge whatsoever of the differences between Africans and Europeans or Caucasians. Again, this is highlighted in the fact that, you know, of course there's been revolutionary characters within the UK which have most likely been written out of history. But we don't have Martin Luther Kings, we don't have Malcolm X's, we don't have really prominent, significant leaders within civil rights that have made it into the consciousness of the general population. And I suppose that speaks to the sort of psychological colonization that takes place in Europe, which is just as powerful as the physical persecution murder and attacks on Afro-Caribbeans in other parts of the world, such as the United States of America. So I think that the problem that we are trying to mitigate and trying to deal with in Europe and in the UK is such that we're in a situation where colonialism and slavery and the impacts of that are categorically denied. Whereas in the United States of America, I'm not saying it's better, however, there is a general understanding that this did take place, that there was benefits from it, and that African American people are disadvantaged. And I think that the thing for me that's really obvious is that Pan-Africanism is essential. I think that Afro-Caribbean people need to kind of have these forums to discuss our situation in the world and on the world stage, and to heal from the way that we have been splintered and fractured all over the world through the transatlantic slave trade and through economic migration as well, so that we can, for the first time, define our own existence and define our own terms, because it really does impact us not just from a social perspective, but also from an economic and legal perspective in terms of how we're seen in a court of law when things happen to us. The difference, you know, between being non-descendable. So I've written a chapter in a book called The Loud Black Girls Anthology, and I talk about representations and transferred representations, and the fact that we are referred to as black is fascinating in itself, you know, because I think one of the biggest issues facing African diaspora is the fact that in many cases the children of slavery don't necessarily know where they're from in Africa. So they're not protected by any particular international rights. And I think that is a really big issue that we need to negotiate. So, you know, the reason it is so important and so palpable for us to come together and negotiate these issues, and also for non-Black or non-Afro-Caribbean people to also facilitate our progress, is because as a consequence of the transatlantic slave trade, Africans and African diaspora have been left in a very dislocated situation. And, you know, in terms of social justice, if we really want to say that we care about humanity, that we care about equality, then things do need to change. And I really don't have an issue either way, but I feel it's really important for human beings to be honest. So if we as a society don't care and our main purpose is capitalism and the pursuit of fiat currency or money or jewels, then that's okay, but admit it and own it. Don't put yourself out to the world as if you care about equality and democracy if you don't, because that is not beneficial. And I suppose...
I wanted to ask you just a little bit more, because there was something that you said that just made me think in terms of the whole kind of civil rights movement and the whole conversation and evolution of a public discourse and a public conversation around the place and the history of Black people in the US, and having been able to progress that conversation to the public space through the last decades, and how that doesn't necessarily equate to what has happened in the UK. But do you think that at some point, because of the fact that there's such an hegemonic presence of the US in popular culture around the world, do you think that maybe we tricked ourselves? When I say we, I mean kind of in the UK, did we believe that perhaps we were in a way, you know, drinking from the same Kool-Aid without actually doing the work?
Exactly. So in this chapter, I write a lot about, I called it transferred representations, and it goes very much to the export of Blackness across the world. And what we see is, with the advancement and the historical progress of Hollywood, we see these images of Blackness exported all around the world. And so too with that, the negative aspects of it have been transferred and perpetuated and implanted and programmed into the minds of black and non-black people all over the world. So often in the United Kingdom, because so little research is done, whenever we're talking about African diaspora, we have to refer to African American research. We have to refer to African American civil rights movements, because we don't have any such thing in the UK. And it's almost like, it's really fascinating to me, because the people that should be at the forefront of exposing that, such as academics, are not. Obviously, a lot of them are Caucasian and white, and perhaps it's not important to them to expose that, and there is good work being done by individuals, but it's something that I find just quite mind-blowing, that we've been relying on this research from a completely different continent to try to explain and to justify progress, when in fact we should be focusing on our own history, archiving that, researching that, and understanding the specific nature and impact of colonialism on the children of slavery and of African diaspora, generally speaking.
Yeah. Thank you. That was I think, an important point to make and to go back to, because I'm quite curious about the article that I will try to read, and we might be able to put that available as well for people who are interested, because I think that is definitely one point that we need to build on.
100%.
Yeah, and to perhaps spend a little bit more time doing that work.
When we look at South America, in other parts of the world, like such as Brazil, to, I suppose, Nigeria, often in general conversations with, non-academic Caucasian white people who are not, who are more working class, who are not in jobs where they're exposed to a variety of different cultures, they genuinely believe that black people are African American people, and they expect you to have the same behaviors and cultures. And I think things like the N-word and the use of that, which do not happen in somewhere like Britain regularly. With the advent of popular culture, I found a lot of my Caucasian white friends from my working class backgrounds using those words and thinking it was okay. And then I had to explain to them, it's only really African Americans that use that word. Like, I personally am not cool with you using that word. And I could see their naivety and pure ignorance and lack of understanding that what they saw on television was not a typical attribute of Africans, and that Africans, that's a generalization as it were, because the continent is vast, are not what you see on television. Yeah. So that's why I called it programmed transferred representations.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to stay with that episode that you just brought in terms of like your friends and how those interactions happen. Before I go back to Shola, but before I go, there is a narrative that persists to this day in a lot of people's minds that Scotland is somehow more progressive than the rest of the UK. When I say the UK, a lot of times that's represented by England. That systemic racism institutions, from the police to cultural organizations, are less malign or less prevalent here. And how does that, I wanted to know how this chimes with you when we have initiatives like the Fringe of Colour, which has been created by a group of kind of young activists as well in the cultural sector, trying to kind of bring to light more of the work that is kind of relates to Black and Brown lived experiences. They've come out and pointed the finger at the dire lack of representation in the arts festivals arena. Or also when people like Sir Geoff Palmer or Glasgow councillor Graham Campbell, after years of activism in academia and local government respectively, are still having to make the case for Scotland to address its role in transatlantic slave trade and acknowledge its own history with issues like the ones that you've already highlighted around, the street names of slave owners that exist in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. So for one hand, we have this belief that Scotland is progressive and projecting itself to the world in that way. In the other hand, there's all of this kind of hidden history that plays out to this day in a city like Edinburgh that has festivals that host millions of people coming every year, but still is not able to have what you would say a diverse range of offering for arts in this day and age. So how?
I think it's a really excellent question. And I think it's really, what I'll say is this, is that I think Scottish people themselves are, generally speaking, really not aware of the history, and are really, I think because there weren't so many actual slaves in Scotland, and actually many Scottish people were slave owners who didn't have the slaves in the country, but they would have went out and worked on plantations wherever that was. This is why in the Caribbean we see so many people named, Campbell, and very Scottish names. So I think that's partially why. But I definitely agree that Scottish people do see themselves in that light. On one hand, I do agree 100%. To me, I find Scotland a very dynamic, forward-thinking culture, which is the opposite to the way that it's represented to the world, which is usually coined within the terms of Caillardism, Clydesidism, and Tartantry. So very much looking back, parochial Scotland, majestic sweeping landscapes and hills and mountains, and that is the kind of way that it is exported and sold to the world. It's not exported and sold to the world in the way that we all see when we're in Glasgow in the West End, or walking down the street in Princes Street, which is a highly diverse, multicultural environment. But what's really interesting is when you go into the rest of the UK, part of the reason I believe that you do not see black and brown people migrating here from parts of England is because they hold the perception which is opposite to that. They hold the perception of Scotland that it is a racist place. The main stereotypes of Scotland that I personally encounter when I leave Scotland is it's racist and cold. And,
The two might be right.
So, and I have to explain to people that I don't really see Scotland as any more racist than any other part of the UK. I think the only difference in Scotland is that if somebody doesn't like you, you'll probably know. And it's kind of similar to European countries like France, where if somebody doesn't like you because of the colour of your skin, they're more likely to make you aware of that. Whereas in places like England, they're less likely to actually say that directly to you, and that speaks to their culture. Within the culture of England, it's regardless of racism or race, people tend to be much more passive-aggressive, much less confrontational. I had many experiences where, as a young fashion model, I would go to castings in the UK and I wouldn't get the job. And I had no idea why that was. And when I started working in Europe, I was in a situation, in a few situations in a few European countries where I was told categorically, well, you're fantastic, but you're just too dark. And, to me, that was actually amazing. It was like the most liberating experience, because for the first time in my life, I was like, oh, okay, I'm really good. I'm just not what they're looking for. Like, I'm too dark. Like, oh, so it's not there's a problem with me. It's just that my look doesn't fit what they want. And I think psychologically, it is important for human beings to be able to articulate their beliefs, even if we don't agree with them, because then we're in a situation where we can actually address it, and we're not in a situation where we're in denial, or we're in this kind of like state where a lot of black and brown people are, where they don't even know that that exists themselves, and that they doubt their personal ability. And I think as a black woman, one of the biggest issues in Western society, particularly in the UK, is the way we've been erased from public life. And you might think that, you could look at the many industries, as a matter if it's dance or ballet or theatre or music, even music, popular culture, dark-skinned women are nowhere to be seen, which is unbelievable when you look at, if you go back to the 60s and the 70s, right up to the 70s, you see popular music as we know it is defined by black and brown people, going back to obviously jazz, etc., etc. And there were so many powerful voices from the Supremes and so on, right through to your kind of modern kind of house music people. And we had so many black women who are so responsible, Donna Summers, disco, etc. And then we see this change where we've been totally deleted from reality, yet everything that we have created in terms of our Afro-Caribbean or culture, African diasporic culture as Black women, in terms of fashion, in terms of style, in terms of music, in terms of everything that we have innovated has been appropriated, but we're not allowed to exist within the space. Yeah. And people are now at the point where they don't even understand where it comes from. Yeah. You know, I went to a high street store and they have these braid bars that have opened, and they referred to the cane roll as a boyfriend braid. And to me, that blew my mind. There are lots of examples, recent singers such as Adele, you know, wearing the Bantu knot, and people just do not understand why that is so offensive. And the thing is, this is why education is so central, because if you're a non-Black person, or even a Black person that doesn't understand the history, when you understand that this here, for example, the cane roll is not the cane roll. It comes from the Keloise, and the Keloise in our culture, in Yoruba culture, means small creature that crawls. And it's a thousands and thousands year old tradition that is connected to spiritual practices and beliefs and is essential to hair growth and maintenance and bonding. And it only became the cane roll because of the transatlantic slave trade, because we used to work in the fields, and the field resembled what? Rose, which is why it's now called the cane roll. So when you see people in the 21st century doing that hairstyle that's existed longer than this part of the world and renaming it and just wearing it as if it doesn't mean anything, that is very offensive. That'd be like me taking the bagpipes and playing them in the street, and someone come up to me and saying, oh, those are the bagpipes, and me saying, no, this is not the bagpipes, this is the black pipe. And it has nothing to do with Scotland, and it's my thing, and I'm doing it. Like, you'd be like, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? This is bagpipes. This comes from Scotland. It's got a long history. You should respect that thing. So when you don't have an understanding of the history of something, that's the only time that you don't understand cultural appropriation. And it's really interesting because the majority of popular culture right now in the 21st century is actually taken directly from particularly Black women. And that goes right to massive fashion brands, which I love, a lot of them, whose whole style and image is kind of based on 80s Black women in New York. So, you know, it's a really interesting situation that we're in now. And I think, again, education is really, really key for all of us to understand where we are now and how we got there. And I think that Scotland, just as much as any other country that's benefited from slavery and the proceeds of crime in that sense, does need to acknowledge that. People don't need to be scared that they're going to, you know, have to pay reparations, which is possibly at the heart of why it's so vehemently opposed, even acknowledging it and teaching it properly. Because you can't go back in history and you can't undo history. But I do think that there, within the concept of social justice, there is an onus, if we want to again call ourselves an equal and a society that's striving towards equality, that we as individuals, if we find out that, you know, our granddad had slaves and everything we've got comes from that, then why would you not go out and do charity? Why would you not make sure that you support a local youth centre or you support something that helps people?
Yes, I don't know. Let's leave that question there, because I want to go back to a number of things that you've just mentioned, and there was so much there that you just shared with us around appropriation, around representation, that I think we need to go back to and maybe unpick. I'm not sure that we'll have enough time to go through it today. Shola, I wanted to pick on what Eunice was saying around appropriation, because it's something that is present in your book. And so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into something that one of the reviewers that I was reading on your book calls historical revisionism, and I think you have called it affirmative history. And so in your book, you offer alternatives to the actual story that you're telling. So putting in evidence that that era of the 1920s, 30s failure to include across the so-called color lines is something that could have played out differently. And so you offer that by submitting a spectrum of possibilities. You denounce the way in which Black culture across history has influenced white European culture and yet has been denied its provenance, which is something that Eunice very clearly was stating in her speaking as well. And what you also put in evidence is the castrating role that gatekeepers, such as archivists, traditional white archivists, continually to play by projecting their prejudices while managing history, furthering the case for an urgent process of decolonizing museums and institutions. And is that thinking what is behind that element of your book?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's definitely a huge part of it, and like really just goes back into like what I was saying before about like the gatekeeping of archiving of history books, of museums, of galleries, the way that, for example, they essentially sit on this treasure trove of you know, this, you know, my book speaks specifically to like Black Europe, to the history of like the African diaspora in Europe, and the way that, just the way that things, you know, there are these like treasures essentially pertaining to like our history, which have been sitting in galleries, sometimes for centuries, sometimes literally decaying, before they get any attention, if they ever get any attention. And yet the sort of like very small scope of what is allowed to be seen on like in the gallery space, which is sort of recycled over and over and over again, is like, it's absurd. So yeah, my book speaks to that. It speaks to the way that this, also the subtle, well, it tries to the subtle ways that archivists, that gallerists, that museum people gatekeep these images, this history, whether it's, as I said before, unconscious bias, but also like something that's not spoken about enough is just the fact that there are going to be racist people working in these institutions, in these like institutionally racist institutions. Why do people think that they're not actively keeping certain things out? Which sort of, you know, we see at play in the novel, where, you know, one of the archivists in the sort of national, or it's kind of like a pseudo National Portrait Gallery photographic archive, and one of like the junior archivists sees a photo of like, you know, a Black woman at a party in the 1920s in Britain, and he says, this is like not a real, it's fake, it's from the 90s, it's from the 1980s, it can't be real because it's a Black woman at a party in the 1920s. And I've seen that happen. You know, I've seen people, that thought process play out in real life. People like have a cognitive dissonance seeing Black people in history in like certain periods which they don't associate with Blackness. Is something really like horrific and interesting that happens there. So, yeah.
And how hopeful are you? Because part of the context in which we're living at the moment is one where conversations around decolonizing of institutions such as museums or portrait galleries or any space that holds, you know, a collective memory, are being pushed or are themselves coming into the limelight and saying that they're making commitments. And I know that a lot of conversations have been had about how honest or how genuine these commitments are. From where you're sitting and from the research that you've done and the milieus in which you exist, how do you see it? Do you have a genuine hope that this is?
Not really. I think that there are sort of pockets of honesty and sort of positive intentionality there, but ultimately, and some of these museums and galleries I love and have, you know, have like been foundational to my writing and my work, but like ultimately they do need to be abolished. I do believe in like the abolition of the British Museum. I believe in the abolition of like National Gallery of Scotland, and like a much more transformative way of like presenting history and archives in the future. I don't even know what that looks like, and I feel like there's like a grand project ahead of us, which is like, so many people have been doing it, like Black scholars like Saidiya Hartman, and just like imagining what a landscape without a museum would look like, and what would be there instead, and that's where like the hope lies.
Oh, that sounds really exciting in terms of revisiting and repositioning all of that, but also then imagining, and your book does that in a way, in the sense, because there's an element of it where I think the character Agnes kind of takes forward and questions some of these institutions, and so there's a process of reclaiming.
Yeah, and she's literally stealing things from Agnes is like a woman, a sort of I guess Black Haitian British woman living in London, and she's worked at places like the British Museum in the 70s, but she's been stealing from the archives. She's been stealing images of Black people from these archives because she knows that they will either be lost, they will be whether it's through deterioration or just sort of being passed around and literally getting sort of lost in like the grey zones of like the, shunting around between archives. So like her stealing and creating her own museum in her like council flat in London is like a kind of reclamation, and she's doing this kind of restorative work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's a theme that is recurrent in the book, because even your main character Matilda, as she's investigating more about Hermia, it feels like all of the potential sources of research are very obscure. The book that she's looking to find of Black modernisms it's a whole kind of like, it's a very difficult path for her to access it, and any additional information that you would have expected to have been documented and archived in that way that we're talking about is somehow very obscure and difficult and convoluted. And so it's really interesting, the issue around the role that gatekeepers play in terms of what these accepted narratives that we have been given, and tacitly accepted, I guess, in a way, because those were the ones that we were told. And so now it's like the unpeeling and the unveiling of it. So when thinking of the problematic of, sorry, Shola, did you want to add?
I was just agreeing.
When thinking of the problematic of gatekeepers, I was also considering the issue of tastemaking and who gets to do it and how it plays out in the fashion industry. And you've already kind of alluded to that. Through recent history, there have been various moments where cultural appropriation has been denounced and expressed itself on the catwalk, in casting moments and producing moments, perpetuating the habit of white culture stealing from black culture, all the while damning and subjugating Black lives. So I guess this one is for either of you. Do you see a progression in industries such as fashion industry, or even we're getting into the publishing industry as well, in terms of being conscious of this hypocrisy and actively putting changes in place for that to stop happening?
Do you want to go first?
You get first.
I think I think in the fashion industry, there's definitely been significant institutional movements to diversify. We see this with the appointment of people like Edward Enninful as the new editor of Vogue, but this has literally only been in the last kind of like 3 to 5 years.
Yes.
However, I would still argue that the majority of the diversity that we see is very much performative activism, I'd like to call it, because the majority of the Black and brown figures that we're seeing being called upon to speak covering magazines are not necessarily those who have actually lived or believed in diversity and ensuring that Afro-Caribbean voices are treated equally. What tends to happen is the people that are given those platforms are the people who haven't been involved in the struggle, who haven't been part of the movement, and who are not respected necessarily by Afro-Caribbean communities as genuine, authentic people who have sacrificed to ensure that we create a diverse society. So there are a lot of people in the African diaspora who are maybe not as famous or as successful as they should be because they've taken a very definitive stance to talk about these issues, which was extremely unpopular pretty much until very recent history in the United Kingdom to talk about race. It was completely frowned upon. You were seen as having a chip on your shoulder, something was wrong with you. And we see in the furor of the George Floyd situation, many people performing activism, performing that they care about stamping out racism. But the reality is, when you look at a lot of the black and brown people who are getting the platform, who are being put on magazine covers, nowhere in their history have they been actively speaking about these issues. So, and what happens is, because a lot of the tastemakers and people in positions of power, whether that's producers, casting directors, are white, they themselves are not aware of this dislocation between actual everyday people and the people they're choosing to put into these positions of power. So I think that in order for the changes to be long-lasting, it's essential for people to do their research, to not just go to the person that they know that happens to be black and ask them to come and talk about a topic. It's essential for them to actually talk to people in the Afro-Caribbean community, ask them who they'd like to hear from, ensure that the people that they're giving opportunities to genuinely have a track record in those industries, because authenticity is everything, whether you're black, white, brown, upside down, it doesn't matter. People want to hear from people that they genuinely believe in and have that cultural authenticity. If you put any old person there, that's not going to connect to the general everyday population.
And it could potentially do
it's
more
even
harm
more
than,
damaging,
yes, than
because
good.
you know, people, everyday normal people, then feel like that you know, it's not even that, it's the fact that that person that you're calling upon is not going to be aware of the true and everyday issues. So when they're speaking on that topic, they're not articulating that, they're not communicating that. So therefore, the person that's given them that opportunity feels like they've done a good job, when actually haven't even scratched the surface of what the issues are.
I guess the other side to that, and I'd put it to you, Shola, because I think it connects in a way also with your book, is the danger that some of this attention that is being brought now into these conversations, stories, narratives, experiences, they could potentially be a trend in disguise. And so that they could actually do very little to debunk the kind of narrow, monolithic understanding that exists in society to this day of our diverse lives experiences as black people, and that go beyond this tokenistic idea of the black person, associated sometimes with kind of the refugee, asylum seeker, and some sort of stereotypes. So I guess this is a question for all of us. Like, how do we hone in on this moment and make it sustainable and longer term shift? And how do we counter this tendency, the phenomenon that expresses itself in the media, of having to push someone, sometimes pushing someone to represent an entire group? And I think in terms of literary terms, we were mentioning this in an earlier conversation with you, Shola, around like figures like Bernardine Evaristo and Rani Eddo-Lodge, whose books have become the first female black books to top sellers in the UK. But then with that comes this plague almost of having to now speak on all of these platforms and literature festivals and literary spaces and being seen to speak on behalf of a whole group. What is that?
Yeah, I mean, also just off of what you were saying, I think this is like a period when like cultural amnesia sets in very quickly. The publishing landscape like has dramatically changed literally over the past 2 years, like the figures from 2016, which I think we like spoke about before, was something like 166,000 or 160,000 new titles were published in Britain in 2016, and out of that 100 were by writers of colour, like 100 out of 160,000, and then out of that 33 of those were like self-published. And 33 of the ones which were published, I think, were cookbooks. So that leaves like 33 new titles that were published in 2016. How many of those were black? How many of those were novels? How many of those were like experimental novels? How many were literary fiction? Do you know what I mean? Like it's like you can count it on your hand essentially. And I think it's quite easy to like how quickly cultural amnesia sets in, like where we are now, where we've had like Bernardine Evaristo winning the Booker Prize, and we've had like black women on the bestsellers list. It can be very easy to forget that how far we've come, but at the same time, people like Bernardine Evaristo have spoken about how they've seen this happen before. They've seen sort of say like when Zadie Smith was starting to get huge, and there were other groups. There was like small groups of black British women writers happening, and Bernardine said, "Where are they all now? Like we just know of her and Zadie, and maybe a couple of others, but many of them have stopped writing. Like it's harder to get an agent and keep an agent if you're a black British writer, and all of that plays into like the longevity of like a literary career. Yet at the same time, it's really easy to fall into like, I guess, overly playing to like representation politics and not like digging deep enough, and like ultimately we could slip back. That could like really happen, and I think it just takes a few sort of cultural shifts and political shifts for that to happen, for publishers to stop publishing black people. It could like we're actually like really close to like that dissolve, so the only way to counteract that is through like resisting capitalism, the way capitalism works, those dynamics in the publishing industry. And like my own publisher, I'm really lucky to be with, because they're a black, it's a small independent black women-run publisher. I think there's like a small team of like 5 black and brown women, and like my book's been published through this 20 in 2020 initiative. What a year to be publishing 20 writers for a small publisher. And yeah, so they're publishing 20 black British writers in 2020 based on like the figures that I was just talking about, which single-handedly like, who knows, like quadruple like things that were going on in 2016. This is a tiny publisher which is like putting to shame major publishing houses with like so much ammunition and so much money, and so I guess it's just, I'm just highlighting like what happens when like small independent organizations sort of start stepping away from, well, just start like getting attention and start doing their own thing. Really, like not, I guess I'm saying like, I'm trying to talk about like not feeding those like huge multinationals, which can be quite hard to do. Like once you start looking at who's connected to who, it becomes like very difficult to cut away from.
That's an excellent example of countering that narrative as well, and also in the sense the question around how do we counter this idea that it could be a trend that disappears, and how do we make it long-lasting? And it sounds like with Jacaranda Publishing, which is your publisher, what they're doing is exactly that. And it's interesting that some of these examples are coming from smaller, more grassroots, more community-led organizations and groups of people who are coming together and really finding solutions outside of the box and being creative about it, and not really waiting for the big multinationals, because also obviously some of what is mentioned here in terms of how genuine those efforts really are, and how embedded in real research and real work are they, or how cosmetic they can be. Well, I've really enjoyed having this conversation with the both of you, and obviously would continue for hours and hours, but I don't think that that's possible at this time. So as we come to the end of this conversation, I kind of wanted to really talk, well, first of all, express my gratitude for your time and your generosity, obviously, and the openness that you've showed in discussing some of these themes. And I wanted to just ask one last question. And this is based on the idea that led an entire nation to vote in Barack Obama, the very first Black president in the US. And the idea is hope. So I wanted us to finish with this concept of hope. And both of you have mentioned episodes in your youth when your ideas of self were stained by prejudices that society was imposing on you. For you, Eunice, that had to do with believing that you didn't fit into a pattern of beauty and the insecurities that brought about. For you, Charlotte, it played out in the desire to emulate and share spaces with your heroes like Virginia Woolf, only to then find yourself having to contend with conflicting feelings of being ostracized because of who you are and how you look. So knowing what you know now, I'm very aware that you're both far from hitting your middle-age years, so I'm not saying that you have a lot to live yet, but knowing what you know now today, what would be one thing that you would say to your younger selves that you think maybe could have been important, thinking of all of the conversations that we've had today?
I think I'll keep it very short just because I'm really conscious of time, but I would literally say, don't believe the hype. One person can literally change the world.
Excellent. And what would you tell yourself?
Sorry, can I just get that answer once more? Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah, but look at the time, just so you guys know.
Yeah. Do really quickly.
Wrapping up.
I would just say, literally, don't believe the hype. One person can change the world.
Thank you.
I guess feeding into what I was saying before, in publishing there's like a huge kind of like rejection/failure culture, and it's like count every rejection as a blessing, like every failure like improves you. And I'd say like that's absolute bullshit, because like if you are like a minority like writer or artist, you don't know if you're being rejected because your work just simply doesn't fit into like the hegemony. And so yeah, I'd say not to worry about that or something. I don't know.
Good. Well, thank you again, both of you, for this wonderful conversation. And thank you for the people who followed the conversation, because it wouldn't make sense without you. I hope our discussion offered you a perspective on the theme of this year, which is vulnerable bodies, and that you hopefully learned something from it that you can take with you. I would urge you to check out the rest of the Flup program online for events like this, and also do follow these two wonderful, creative and outspoken human beings on their social media as well if you can, and if you want to learn more about their work, obviously. So there's only one last thing for me to say, and is to bid farewell from Scotland to you. So thank you and goodbye.